The ground bore the weight of vanished men, rifles scattered, helmets overturned, but not a single soldier left standing. Whole battalions walked into the haze and were never seen again. Commanders silenced the reports, records scrubbed their names, and only rumors slipped through the cracks. They spoke of something not born of war, a force that preyed on men like game, leaving nothing but silence behind. No blade cut it, no bullet slowed it, and those who glimpsed it swore it was not of this world. This was the enemy, no army survived. The forested battlefield looked ordinary at first, just mud, barbed wire, and shattered trees torn by shells. Yet soldiers whispered that something was wrong. No bodies remained where entire regiments had clashed, only abandoned rifles and helmets half buried in muck. It was as though the land itself had consumed the fallen or racing men without leaving the dignity of a grave. Commanders grew uneasy when patrols failed to return. They sent scouts into the woods, armed with rifles and lanterns. But silence always followed. Hours turned into days, and the men never came back. All that was discovered were neat rows of boot prints that ended abruptly in the mud, like soldiers had stepped into the air and disappeared. Rumors spread quickly through the ranks. Some claimed enemy ambushes were responsible, but there were no signs of gunfire, no trails of blood. Others whispered of something larger, something waiting in the forests that flanked the trenches. Every disappearance carried the same pattern: entire groups gone, equipment left behind, and the silence of an unfinished march. The first survivors emerged, half mad. One stumbled into camp alone, his uniform shredded, his eyes hollow. He muttered of a roar that shook the trees, of shadows that moved against the firelight, of comrades ripped away into the dark. Before he could say more, his voice failed him. He collapsed, never rising again, leaving only his broken rifle as proof of his tale. Officers tried to cover the stories, fearing panic. They marked the woods as impassable, blaming swamps and unstable ground. But soldiers were not fools. They knew the difference between mud and something alive. Each time a battalion entered, fewer returned. Maps were revised, reports destroyed, and the vanished were marked simply as missing. The forest carried its own evidence. Helmets littered the ground like trophies, rifles bent as if crushed in immense jaws, and trenches collapsed inward as though something had crawled beneath them. When men ventured near, they felt the ground tremble faintly under their boots. Whatever claimed the battalions had not gone, it still lingered. At night, strange sounds echoed from the trees. Not artillery, not rifles, but something deeper. A guttural growl that made even seasoned officers tremble. Soldiers woke from nightmares, swearing they had heard the sound inside their skulls. Some refused to sleep altogether, watching the tree line with rifles clenched in white-knuckled hands. One battalion swore they saw it. Shadows moved at the edge of their camp, taller than men, bulkier than horses. Lantern light caught glimpses of scales, of teeth glistening in the dark before the flames sputtered out. When the light returned, half the men were gone, their tents shredded like paper. No screams, no fight, just absence. The survivors begged their superiors not to return, but war has no mercy for fear. Another battalion was ordered forward. This time, with heavier weapons, they set traps, dug pits, and aimed machine guns toward the forest. The night fell quiet, but then the earth trembled. The men opened fire wildly, bullets vanishing into darkness. The roar that answered silenced them all. By dawn, only smoke and shattered trees remained. The machine guns were twisted, as though bent by colossal hands. Trenches that once housed dozens of soldiers yawned empty, their sandbags torn apart. No blood stained the ground, no corpses lay scattered. The battalion had been erased, as though it had never existed. Letters home from soldiers told fragments of the truth. Some wrote of being watched from the tree line, of eyes burning red in the night. Others confessed they feared the war less than the thing hiding in the woods. Many of those letters never reached families. They were intercepted, destroyed, part of the effort to bury the story before it spread. The enemy lines knew of it too. Prisoners spoke of patrols lost without combat, of cries heard in the distance that made even hardened veterans refuse to advance. For once, both sides shared the same terror. The war had created an enemy beyond them, one that cared nothing for flags or nations, only for flesh. As the disappearances mounted, whispers of an erased regiment spread, superstition grew. Men refused to march into certain valleys, insisting they belonged to the beast. Officers responded with threats, but even punishment could not force them forward. They would rather face the firing squad than vanish into the woods like those before them. Eventually, commanders stopped sending men altogether. The region was marked on maps as unstable ground, an excuse to hide the truth. Orders were drawn to bypass it, but even then patrols strayed too close. Those who wandered off paths were never seen again. The wilderness had claimed its territory, and no general dared challenge it. Years later, scavengers returned to the battlefields to collect scraps of metal and supplies. When they reached that forest, they fled. They found no bones, no rusted helmets, only silence so deep it pressed on their chests. Even decades after the war, the ground seemed to breathe, carrying echoes of footsteps that belonged to no living men. Local villagers whispered their own tales. They said the land had always been cursed, that men had vanished there long before the war. Hunters, travelers, even whole families had disappeared into the trees. The war only fed it more, giving the wilderness entire battalions to devour. The beast was not born of battle. It had waited for it. The more people spoke, the more consistent the details became. Always the roar, always the trembling ground, always men erased without a trace. Some swore they had seen soldiers marching, still ghostly outlines between the trees, locked in an eternal patrol that never ends. The beast had not just devoured their bodies, it had claimed their souls. Archaeologists who attempted to investigate found nothing. Their tools broke, their notes vanished, and their camps were dismantled overnight. They left quickly, too shaken to stay. It was as though the land itself rejected being studied, as though it demanded to remain untouched, its secrets buried beneath silence. Modern soldiers who trained near the old battlefield reported strange experiences. Radios crackled with voices that did not belong to their unit, speaking in forgotten tongues. Boots marched at night where no men walked, and in rare moments, a deep bellow rolled through the forest, shaking branches, though no wind blew. The legend had not faded, it had only grown. Historians who dared to trace records noticed patterns. Pages were missing from official reports. Entire battalions listed as unaccounted for. Numbers did not match survivors. Records contradicted themselves. The gaps were too deliberate, as though someone had worked tirelessly to erase the truth before it reached the public. But stories never die. Veterans on their deathbeds spoke of comrades swallowed by the forest, of nights where shadows loomed over camps before silence returned. Their eyes widened with fear even decades later, as if recalling not a memory but a nightmare that never released them. Some theorized it was no beast at all, but the land itself alive, feeding on the chaos of war. Others argued it was something older, a predator that had hunted men long before battle gave it such plentiful prey. Whatever the explanation, the fact remained entire battalions had vanished, and nothing of them remained. Today, the region remains avoided. Travelers speak of hearing boots marching in the night, of helmets glinting briefly in the underbrush before fading into mist. They say the forest remembers, and it hungers still. No one enters willingly, and those who do rarely return. The beast was never captured, never killed, never named in official history, but its silence remains louder than any cannon, its hunger deeper than any trench. Where the battalions vanished, the land itself became a tomb without markers, a wound that no war could close. And so, the story endures. Soldiers marched in, proud and defiant, but they left nothing behind. The forest swallowed them whole, and the world was told to forget. Yet forgetting does not erase the truth, it only feeds it, and in that cursed place, the truth still waits, patient and hungry. The night was thick with the sounds of war, rifles cracking, shells exploding, men shouting through the haze. Then, without warning, a noise unlike any weapon tore through the battlefield. It was no cannon, no bomb. It was a roar so deep it shook helmets from heads and rattled the rifles in soldiers' hands. Every gun fell quiet in its wake. At first, the men thought it was thunder rolling over the horizon, but the sky was clear. the stars sharp against the blackness. The roar came again, closer this time, and the very ground trembled beneath their boots. Horses bucked wildly. Men dropped to their knees, and even seasoned veterans felt their courage slip. The sound was alive. It carried rage, hunger, and something older than the war itself. Soldiers who had faced machine guns without fear covered their ears, desperate to block out the bellow that seemed to crawl into their bones. When the roar ended, silence consumed the battlefield. Not a shot was fired, not a word spoken. Then the guns jammed. Rifles locked, machine guns refused to fire. Even artillery failed to launch. Weapons that had roared moments before now sat useless in trembling hands. Soldiers cursed and struck their rifles, but the roar had stolen their voices as surely as it had silenced the steel. The beast was not only heard, it was felt. One soldier swore he saw trees bend away from the sound, their trunks groaning like bowing giants. Another claimed the mud itself rippled like water, shuddering each time the roar rolled through. The men didn't know what they faced, but they knew it wasn't flesh and blood. This was something war had no weapon for. Commanders shouted for fire, but their orders meant nothing. Guns clicked, bolts jammed, and barrels refused to ignite. The roar came again, louder than before, tearing through the night like a storm of voices woven into one. Soldiers fell to the ground, covering their heads as though the sky itself would collapse. Those who tried to run fared no better. The sound chased them, echoing through their skulls until their legs gave out. Some collapsed in the mud, writhing as though pierced by invisible blades. Others staggered forward, only to vanish into the shadows, their screams cut short by silence. No bullets, no blades, just a voice that unmade men. When the roar faded, the silence was worse. The battlefield was still, the smoke unmoving, the stars watching with indifference. Soldiers waited, gripping useless rifles, praying for gunfire to return. But the air remained heavy, pressing on their chests, smothering them. They realized then that the roar hadn't ended, it was waiting. At dawn, the survivors counted their numbers. Dozens had vanished, their gear scattered like leaves in the wind. Some helmets still bore fresh sweat, some rifles still loaded, but their owners were gone. The men whispered that the roar had taken them, consumed their very breath, leaving only relics as offerings. The commanders tried to rationalize it. They claimed gas had caused hallucinations, or that artillery had misfired and spooked the men. But no shell left a sound like that. No weapon carried such power. The soldiers knew the truth. The roar belonged to something alive, something that stalked the battlefield as surely as any army. Nights grew worse as the weeks wore on. Every evening, when the darkness thickened, the sound returned. It came from nowhere and everywhere, rolling through trenches, weaving between trees, crawling beneath helmets. Each time it struck, guns failed and men vanished. The roar was not a warning, it was a predator's call. Some soldiers prayed, clutching rosaries until their knuckles bled. Others muttered in broken voices that the war itself had birthed the creature, a beast fed by hatred and bloodshed. None dared speak too loudly, fearing the roar would hear. Even laughter died in their throats, smothered by the memory of that sound. One night, the roar split the air as men prepared to charge. Their rifles refused to fire. Their grenades would not ignite, and their voices cracked as they screamed. Then, from the tree line, shadows stirred. The men swore they saw something vast, moving between the trees, its shape too massive to name. The roar was its breath, and the silence its hunger. The men who faced it were never found. Their trenches collapsed inward, their bayonets snapped like twigs. Only footprints remained, leading into the woods before fading into nothing. The roar had silenced them, body and soul leaving only echoes of their march. Veterans who survived the encounter carried the memory forever. On quiet nights, they flinched at distant thunder, mistaking it for the beast's voice. Some refused to speak of it at all, insisting that words might summon it back. Others swore they still heard it in dreams, the roar shaking their bones long after the war had ended. Commanders buried the reports. Official records mentioned malfunctions and weather interference, but never the truth. The roar was erased from history as though silence could kill what sound had already revealed. Yet silence never lasts. The forest carried the memory forward, retelling it to anyone who dared listen. Local villagers spoke of the same noise. Long before the war, hunters never returned. Travelers fled at dusk, and families abandoned homes when the air began to vibrate with that dreadful sound. They said the roar did not belong to an animal, but to the land itself, the voice of something older than mankind. The deeper soldiers marched, the stronger the sound became. Trenches collapsed under its vibrations, rivers churned as if boiling, and men collapsed, clutching their chests. The roar was not just heard, it was inside them, breaking their resolve, tearing apart the courage that no weapon had been able to. By the end of the campaign, whole battalions had been silenced by it. Not one bullet fired, not one enemy charge needed. The roar swept across their lines like a plague, leaving only empty trenches and abandoned gear. It was a weapon without metal, a predator without form. Some soldiers swore the roar carried voices within it, screams of their lost comrades, shouts of men long dead, woven into the endless bellow. Listening too long drove men mad, their eyes wild, their mouths muttering words that weren't their own. The roar was not a sound, it was a chorus of the devoured. At times, it came from the sky, as though the clouds themselves growled. At others, it rolled up from the ground, shaking roots and trenches alike. No matter where it came from, its effect was the same. Silence followed, and men disappeared. The beast had no shape, but its presence was undeniable. Decades later, archaeologists returned to the old battlefields. They reported strange vibrations in the soil, recordings filled with low-frequency sounds no ear should hear. Equipment failed, compasses spun, and their voices echoed back to them distorted, layered with cries. They fled, leaving their research behind, unwilling to awaken what still slept. Legends persist among locals who live near the forgotten battlefield. They say the roar comes still on quiet nights, rolling through the trees like thunder without clouds. Hunters drop their rifles, their dogs cower, and the woods fall silent. They warn outsiders never to follow the sound, for those who do never come back. The war ended with treaties and borders redrawn, but not every enemy was defeated. Some lingered, nameless, buried beneath the silence of history. The roar had claimed more men than bullets, and yet it was erased from record. But legends outlast paper, and whispers still tell the tale of the sound that silenced guns. The beast was never seen clearly, never killed, never captured. It did not need to be. Its voice alone ended battles, scattering armies without raising a claw, and so it waits still. Somewhere in the silence, its roar echoing across time. An enemy no weapon could strike, no soldier could withstand, and no army ever survived. The first soldier noticed them at dawn, when the mist still clung to the ground like a shroud. In the mud outside their trench lay a print so massive it dwarfed his boot. The edges were sharp, freshly pressed, as if whatever made it had passed only moments before. No man, no horse, no machine left a mark like that. The others gathered around, whispering nervously. The print was long, clawed at the tips, and sunk deep into the earth. The soil was compacted as though under enormous weight, heavier than any animal they knew. It looked wrong, alien, yet undeniably real. Fear took root in their stomachs as they realized this was no ordinary battlefield. Commanders dismissed it at first, calling it a trick of erosion, a collapse of soil under the rain. But the soldiers knew better. Rain did not leave talon marks. Wind did not press the earth with such deliberate force. Something huge had walked through the night, and it had chosen to step directly where men stood guard. The next morning, more prints appeared. They stretched in a line, vanishing into the forest shadow. Each one was spaced far apart, suggesting strides longer than a man could run. The soldiers followed the trail for a short distance, but unease grew with each step. The deeper the prints went, the darker the woods became, until fear drove them back. The prints never stayed in one place. They circled the camp, weaving around trenches and cutting through abandoned clearings. Some men swore they had seen them shift overnight, as though the beast retraced its steps deliberately. It wasn't wandering, it was watching. And the soldiers were certain they were being hunted. By the third week, the prints appeared even in daylight. Soldiers woke to find them freshly stamped beside their tents, still steaming as though the creature's weight carried heat. Men refused to sleep, terrified they might open their eyes to find the beast standing over them. Their nerves frayed until every shadow felt like a predator's gaze. One soldier tried to measure a track with his rifle. The barrel fit neatly inside the footprint, leaving room to spare. He dropped the weapon in shock, muttering that no man was meant to fight what left such a mark. His hands shook for hours afterward, and he begged to be reassigned far from the cursed woods. Reports grew impossible to ignore. Officers investigated but found the prints too consistent, too deliberate to dismiss. They tried to photograph them, but the images came back blurred, smudged, as if the film itself resisted capturing the truth. Each failed photo only deepened the dread. Something walked there, but it refused to be seen. The ground bore more than just footprints. Trees bent unnaturally, their trunks scarred with long gouges as though brushed by claws. Boulders shifted, overturned as though they were pebbles. Once the men discovered an entire trench collapsed, its walls stamped flat. The prints led away from it, massive and undeniable. Some soldiers swore the tracks glowed faintly at night. Lantern light seemed to catch in the soil, illuminating the edges in pale shimmer. Men avoided them, afraid of stepping inside, afraid of being claimed by whatever power lingered there. The prints weren't just evidence, they were warnings carved into the earth. One patrol tried to follow the trail deeper than before. They vanished. Days later, their gear was found scattered near the river, rifles bent and boots torn apart. The prints stopped there, swallowed by water, as if the beast had waded through and disappeared. No bodies were ever recovered. The river carried no answers. Fear spread like sickness. Soldiers refused to march after dark, fearing they might stumble into the beast's path. Some swore they heard it moving in the distance, heavy steps cracking branches, shaking the ground. The sound carried too much weight to be imagination. It felt like thunder that belonged to no storm. Veterans compared the tracks to legends they had heard as children. Stories of monsters older than nations, creatures that prowled forgotten forests and punished those who trespassed. Now those myths felt real. The prints proved that something beyond war walked among them, something that no bullet could stop. As nights grew colder, the tracks pressed deeper into frozen ground. Men could see their shape clearer than ever. 5 long toes, claws curved like hooks, the arch impossibly wide. No natural beast matched it. They whispered that it walked upright, like a man, yet bore the weight of a mountain. The thought left them sleepless. One soldier attempted to disprove the fear. He stepped into a print, laughing that it was only dirt, but as soon as his boot touched the soil, he collapsed, gasping as though his chest were crushed. The others dragged him out, but he never recovered fully. His lungs rattled with every breath, as though the ground itself had cursed him. The commanders banned anyone from approaching the prints again, but it was too late. Men still saw them at the edge of camp, still fresh each morning. They swore the beast chose its paths carefully, making sure the soldiers knew it was close. The prints were not random, they were messages. The ground began to shift under their boots. At times they felt it sag, as if hollow beneath. Some claimed the beast moved below them, its massive body pushing upward, leaving tracks that surfaced only after it passed. The earth groaned with each movement, alive with something buried and restless. One night, the prince appeared in the center of camp. No guard had seen it arrive, no sentry had raised alarm. Yet in the morning, they stretched between the tents, massive indentations where men had slept only hours earlier. The soldiers knew then the beast was not kept away by light or numbers. It walked wherever it pleased. The men's sanity frayed. Some abandoned their rifles, convinced no weapon could match the creature. Others carved strange marks into the dirt beside the tracks, hoping offerings might appease it. The officers punished them, but fear silenced discipline. The men no longer feared the enemy. They feared the steps outside their trench. Scouts sent to watch the trails returned pale and trembling. They spoke of movement too vast to belong to any animal, of trees bending aside as if to allow something through. Their words faltered when asked what they saw. Their eyes grew distant. Their lips refused to form descriptions. Whatever they glimpsed, it was beyond human comprehension. The prints multiplied as winter deepened. Dozens of trails crisscrossed the landscape, some overlapping, some diverging into endless wilderness. It was no longer one beast. It was many, or perhaps one that walked in circles, making itself endless. Soldiers could not decide which truth was worse. By the end of the campaign, entire companies were gone, swallowed by silence where the prince led. The only evidence left behind were trails in the mud too vast for men to make, too deliberate to dismiss. Officers struck the records, replacing them with vague mentions of hostile terrain and natural losses. But legends grew in the shadows. Survivors whispered of what they saw, of what they followed. They said the tracks belonged to the beast the war forgot, the predator no history dared name. Its feet crushed trenches, its roar silenced guns, and its prints carved fear into the earth itself. Even today, in forgotten forests where war once raged, strange tracks appear after storms. Too large for men, too precise for chance, they press into the soil like scars left by something that should not exist. Travelers whisper of following them, only to vanish like the battalions before them. The war ended, but the tracks remained. No bulldozer erased them. No grass grew to cover them. They were more than prints. They were proof. Proof that something walked among men, something history refused to acknowledge. The beast left no body, no bones, no name. Only steps too large for men, and silence that followed them forever. The first reports came from scouts, shaken men who returned pale, muttering of noises in the night and tracks too large to belong to man or beast. Their words were dismissed as nerves. Another casualty of sleepless nights and endless shelling, yet they clutched their rifles as though expecting something to rip them away at any moment. Fear was written in their eyes. When the second set of reports arrived, they were written, soldiers described entire squads gone missing, rifles left behind, trenches filled with strange markings. The tone was restrained, clipped, as though the men feared being called mad, but between the lines, panic bled through. These were not exaggerations, they were warnings. The generals gathered in candle-lit rooms, poring over the papers with grim expressions. Some scoffed, dismissing the accounts as desertion, cowardice, or fabrication. Others stared silently, unwilling to admit the possibility that something outside their understanding was at work. The weight of war was heavy, but this was heavier still. A few officers ordered investigations. Scouts traced the trails, followed the strange prints, and returned with fewer men than they left with. The survivors spoke little, their faces hollow, their eyes darting as if something unseen still followed them. Their reports grew stranger, of shadows that moved without bodies, of roars that silenced gunfire. The more the reports came, the less they were believed. War demanded order, and these accounts threatened chaos. A beast that devoured battalions could not exist. Not in the minds of men trained to fight with discipline. The generals stamped unfounded across the papers, sealing them in files never meant to see daylight. But the soldiers whispered. Stories passed from trench to trench, from fire pit to fire pit. Men swore they had seen comrades vanish into the fog, leaving only screams behind. They whispered that generals knew more than they admitted, that orders to hold ground were death sentences, and perhaps they were right. Some reports were burned outright. Witnesses spoke of stacks of paper fed into flames, the words curling into ash before they could spread. Yet even fire could not erase the fear. The men who wrote them lived, carrying their nightmares in silence, knowing the truth had been buried deeper than any grave. A few documents slipped through. War clerks, unwilling to lose the evidence, hid copies in satchels and journals. Decades later, fragments would surface, blurred photographs, field notes, written in shaking hands, sketches of monstrous footprints. Each scrap contradicted the official record, exposing the cracks in history. The generals feared more than the beast. They feared the collapse of control. An army could not march if men believed the land itself hunted them. So the reports were silenced, rewritten into phrases like unfavorable terrain and unexplained losses. It was easier to blame the weather than admit the impossible. One report, signed by a captain with trembling script, described a night patrol consumed in minutes. He wrote of finding rifles twisted as if by enormous force, of boots torn in half. He begged for reinforcement. for withdrawal, for anything to save his men. His words never left headquarters. The captain vanished soon after. Soldiers who returned alive were marked as unstable. They were reassigned, their reputations smeared, their voices drowned beneath bureaucracy. Shell shock, the generals called it. Though their wounds were not of the mind, some bore claw marks, others carried burns that smelled of sulfur. Their scars were proof, yet proof was denied. The higher the ranks climbed, the quieter the truth became. Whispers claimed some generals saw the beast themselves, glimpses in fog, shadows moving against the moonlight. Their eyes darkened after those nights, yet their tongues stayed silent. To admit what they saw would be to dismantle the entire machinery of war. Entire battalions vanished, and the reports were written as strategic repositioning. No questions asked, no answers offered. Families received letters saying their sons had died heroes in battles that never took place. The truth was swallowed whole, leaving only silence where voices once rang. In time, the sealed reports filled cabinets, locked behind iron doors, files stamped classified, gathered dust, their edges yellowing with age. To the outside world, they did not exist. But the men who filed them never forgot. The whispers followed them home, creeping into their dreams, scratching at the edges of sanity. One clerk confessed years later in a private journal that he had read dozens of these reports. He described drawings of colossal shapes, notes on inhuman strength, and desperate pleas for help. He wrote that every account ended the same way. Erasure, he burned the journal himself, but his testimony remained in fragments. The war ended, but the secrecy endured. Survivors carried the stories, their voices quivering in taverns and around kitchen tables. They spoke not of glory, but of something buried under official silence. Their words never reached newspapers, but they carried weight among those who knew how wars left scars beyond the flesh. Generals retired, taking secrets to their graves. Some were said to have nightmares until their final days, waking drenched in sweat, whispering about footsteps outside their windows. Their families dismissed them as fading minds, but their terror was too raw to ignore. Whatever they buried in the war had followed them home. The forgotten reports became legend. Soldiers' children heard fragments of tales, piecing together half-truths of monsters and silenced battles. Some laughed them off as drunken war stories, but others felt the chill in their father's words, the weight of fear no veteran should carry after victory. Archaeologists later uncovered fragments of trenches long abandoned. They found unusual gouges in the earth, patterns no weapon could explain. Locals whispered that these were the same grounds where battalions had vanished, where reports had been buried. The soil itself seemed to hold the secrets generals tried to erase. The reports weren't merely hidden, they were cursed. Those who handled them spoke of feeling watched, of hearing faint scratching on paper long after it was filed. Files went missing, reappearing days later with words smeared, ink warped as if soaked from within. The truth resisted even its own concealment. In some forgotten archives, a few files still linger. They speak of shadows larger than men, of roars that silenced artillery, of survivors driven mad by what they saw. The handwriting quivers across the page, betraying the fear of the authors. These were not stories, they were confessions. And yet, history books remain silent. They recount victories and losses, generals and strategies, but never the enemy that no army defeated. That absence is louder than any fact. It is the silence of secrets carefully carved out of memory, stitched shut by those too afraid to admit what walked beside them. The beast itself left no records, but the men did. Their words still echo in hidden pages, preserved in fragments waiting for discovery. And every time one resurfaces, the world catches a glimpse of the terror the generals buried, a truth too heavy for ink to contain. But the earth remembers what men tried to forget. It remembers the battalions swallowed whole, the screams that never reached headquarters, the trails that ended in silence. And when the wind shifts across those old fields, some swear the roars return, an echo of the reports that were never meant to be read. The night began like any other on the front, cold air settling across the battlefield, fog curling low through the craters, and the silence after artillery falling heavy on exhausted men. Soldiers cleaned rifles, shared cigarettes, and muttered half-hearted jokes. They had no idea the darkness creeping in would not bring rest, but ruin. The first sign came with the wind. It shifted suddenly, carrying a stench so foul it burned their throats. The men gagged, covering their noses with sleeves. It wasn't the rot of corpses, nor the sour staleness of mud. This was deeper, metallic, and primal, like blood left to stew under the earth. Lanterns flickered along the trench line, their flames twisting violently as though choked by unseen hands. Shadows warped against the mud walls, stretching too long, too sharp, like claws creeping forward. The men exchanged uneasy glances, each waiting for someone else to speak first, their nerves frayed under the weight of the silence. Then the ground trembled, not like the thud of distant shell fire, but a rolling quake beneath their boots. The vibrations slithered upward through their bones, rattling teeth and numbing hands. Some thought of tanks, others of underground explosions. But the truth pressed closer than any human weapon. Something massive stirred below. Without warning, a scream ripped down the line. A sentry vanished into the fog. His cry cut short with sickening speed. The men leapt to arms, rifles raised, but no enemy charged. All that remained was his helmet, spinning in the mud, its echo louder than any shot fired. Fear consumed them. The fog thickened, swallowing the trench in a suffocating shroud. Shapes flickered at its edges, hulking and unnatural, glimpsed for only a heartbeat before dissolving. The soldiers fired wildly, bullets cracking into darkness. Yet the reports were hollow. No cries of pain, no bodies dropping, only silence returning heavier than before. Something moved above them, blotting out the faint moonlight. Heads tilted back, eyes widening in horror as a shadow larger than any tank loomed across the trench. Its outline rippled, serpentine yet jagged, limbs bending in ways no anatomy should allow. It did not march, it hovered, massive and deliberate. The first attack struck like thunder. A section of the trench caved inward, collapsing onto the men. They clawed to escape, but the mud shifted unnaturally, dragging them deeper as though alive. Their screams were muffled by earth closing over them. Within seconds, their shouts were gone, the ground sealing flat. Those who survived scrambled backward, stumbling into each other, rifles shook in trembling hands, bayonets quivering as fear gnawed at every ounce of training. They were soldiers no longer. They were prey cornered in a killing ground. Each heartbeat thundered louder than the cannons they once feared. A roar split the night, so loud it shredded thought. It wasn't just sound, it was force ripping through flesh and bone, throwing men against the trench walls. Ears bled, noses split, and eyes watered under the pressure. They had heard artillery, grenades, thunder, but never a roar that could break a man's spirit so completely. Then came the claws. They struck with lightning speed, dragging men upward into the fog. Bodies flailed helplessly before vanishing, their cries snapping short. Blood rained down into the trench, hot and steaming, spattering across helmets. The survivors cowered, knowing their turn was only moments away. A machine gunner opened fire, streams of bullets cutting through the night. Sparks lit up the fog, revealing glimpses of monstrous scales, a jaw lined with serrated teeth, eyes glowing like burning coals. The sight broke him, his scream louder than his weapon, his mind shattering under the weight of truth. The beast struck again, and the gunner was gone. His weapon clattered into the mud, barrel bent as though crushed in a fist. Soldiers backed away from it, unwilling to touch something tainted by its grasp. The trench narrowed with fear, their world shrinking under an enemy they could not fight. Another roar rolled through the air, this one deeper, carrying words no man could understand. Yet they felt the meaning. It was hunger. The men's knees buckled, hearts sinking as they realized they were not in a battle, they were in a feast. And they were the offering laid at its altar. The beast moved through them like a storm, unstoppable and cruel. Men fired, stabbed, clawed with bare hands, but none slowed its advance. Limbs were torn free, torsos ripped apart, screams echoing against the mud. Each death fed the terror, building a symphony of agony no war song could drown out. Some tried to flee, scrambling over the trench walls. The fog closed around them instantly, swallowing their bodies. For a moment, the others heard their frantic boots pounding on the ground above, then silence. Only silence. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The officers shouted commands, their voices breaking under panic. Discipline shattered. Men no longer a unit, but scattered animals fighting for survival. Maps and orders meant nothing now. The only strategy was to last one more breath, one more moment, before the claws reached them too. A flare shot into the sky, desperate for light. It burst high above, casting pale glow over the battlefield. For the first time, the men saw it clearly, towering, grotesque, its body twisting with unnatural symmetry. Scales glistened like wet stone. Its mouth unhinged wider than a trench. In its presence, hope died. The flare faded quickly, plunging the field into black again. Men sobbed openly, their cries no longer restrained by pride. Some begged God for mercy, others cursed their commanders. But all knew none would survive to see another dawn. This night belonged to the beast. The ground shook as it struck again. A section of the trench collapsed inward, swallowing more men. Their rifles clattered against rocks before being buried. In their place rose the smell of iron and smoke, as though the earth itself had feasted with the creature. No one dared approach the broken ground. A medic clutched his satchel, whispering prayers as he pressed against the wall. When claws reached for him, he didn't scream, he simply froze, eyes wide, until he was lifted into the dark. His satchel dropped, spilling bandages and morphine into the mud. The sight broke the last fragments of hope. The survivors staggered together, clinging to each other for strength. They were fewer now, their numbers cut in half, then halved again. Each man stared hollow-eyed into the fog, waiting. Their rifles were heavy, useless, hanging like anchors on the shoulders of the damned. As dawn approached, the beast vanished into the fog as suddenly as it had come. Silence returned, but not peace. The trench was a graveyard, littered with shredded uniforms and broken steel. Blood pooled where men had stood, and helmets lay overturned like empty skulls. When reinforcements arrived, they found no bodies, only destruction. Reports were written, stamped, and filed under enemy bombardment. No mention of claws, no mention of roars, no mention of the beast that had erased an army in a single night. History turned its face away as it always did. But the earth remembered, and the silence over that battlefield was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of something waiting. Soldiers who marched past years later swore the ground still smelled of blood, and that in the fog, they heard faint roars echoing across the night. And so the truth was buried, erased in ink and silence. Yet the land carried the memory, and the night whispered what the generals dared not admit. An army had been devoured, not by bullets or bombs, but by something far older, something that would never leave the battlefield behind. The battlefield seemed quiet after the fighting ended, the trenches sagging under mud and silence. But beneath the churned earth, something stirred. Men digging shallow graves whispered of soft vibrations below, like a heartbeat trapped under the soil. They buried their comrades quickly, never daring to linger. Engineers trying to fortify positions struck layers of earth that groaned. Shovels bent, dirt shifted back into holes as though refusing to be moved. At night, the pits they had dug filled in on their own, sealing tighter than any man could pack. It was as if the ground itself rejected disturbance. Some soldiers claimed the soil was warm to the touch. They pressed palms into it, expecting cold mud, only to recoil as if touching flesh. The sensation lingered on their skin, prickling like static. One man swore he felt something pulse back against his hand, as though the ground had acknowledged him. The stench worsened with each day. Not the expected reek of corpses, but something far deeper, like sulfur mixed with burning iron. The odor seeped through the trenches, clinging to uniforms and hair. Even after washing, it remained as though it had sunk beneath the skin itself. Rats fled the trenches without warning. Whole colonies vanished overnight, leaving only gnawed bones behind. The men at first welcomed the reprieve, until they realized what it meant. The vermin had abandoned the ground entirely. When even scavengers refused to linger, the soldiers knew they were standing on cursed earth. During a lull in the shelling, men heard sounds beneath the ground. Faint knocks at first, like rocks shifting, then steady patterns. Some swore the beats formed rhythms, almost like messages. A few tapped back with their rifles, but silence followed, stretching so long it curdled into dread. Gravediggers made the most chilling discoveries. As they dug, they found layers of bones not belonging to their comrades. Bones blackened, fused, and twisted into unnatural shapes. Some were massive, thicker than human femurs. Others curved like ribs of beasts never known to science. They buried them quickly, too afraid to study further. In the darkest nights, the soil itself seemed to move. Men awoke to trenches sagging lower, their boots sinking deeper into muck that hadn't been wet before. Some swore they felt the earth breathing, a slow expansion and contraction, the rhythm of lungs beneath layers of dirt. No one slept soundly afterward. Officers forbade talk of what the men found, calling it madness. Yet they themselves walked the lines at night, staring uneasily at the ground. They heard it too, the groans, the subtle shifts, the faint trickle of something thicker than water moving below. Silence became the only command they could enforce. One soldier drove his bayonet into the mud in frustration. He yanked it back, expecting filth, but the blade was slick with something black and viscous. The substance smoked as it dripped, burning holes through his uniform where it splattered. He threw the weapon away, screaming it was alive. The black substance appeared again days later, oozing up from cracks in the trench floor. It pooled like tar, glistening faintly under lantern light. Those who touched it grew sick within hours, skin blistering, fevers burning them from the inside. The medics had no cure, and the officers buried the victims quietly. One night, a trench wall collapsed, revealing something buried deep. At first, it looked like stone, but when the lanterns caught its surface, it glistened like bone. A massive structure arched beneath the earth, curving too precisely to be natural. It stretched beyond sight, a ribcage of impossible proportions. The men sealed the wall quickly, refusing to dig further. But the image burned into their minds. They were living inside something's grave, or perhaps inside its body. The thought spread through the unit like disease, eroding discipline until no one dared touch the earth again. Strange sounds echoed after bombardments. Instead of silence, the ground emitted long, hollow moans, as though the shells had woken something buried beneath. The vibrations rattled helmets, shook rifles, and set teeth on edge. Some men vomited from the sensation, unable to withstand the resonance inside their skulls. Footprints began appearing overnight, pressed deep into the trench floors. But these were not tracks of men or beasts. They were shapes no soldier recognized, long, splayed impressions, curved at the edges like talons. The earth wasn't holding them. It was producing them, as if the ground itself remembered being walked upon. Letters home carried cryptic notes, soldiers hinting at the unease beneath their boots. "It feels alive here," one wrote, "like the soil wants to keep us." Many of those letters never reached families, confiscated by censors who saw the danger of spreading panic. The men's voices were smothered before they could escape. One night, the earth split without warning. A fissure tore down the trench, swallowing tents and equipment in seconds. The men scrambled back, watching helplessly as their supplies vanished into the dark. From below rose a sound none could explain. A deep, guttural rumble, half growl, half laughter. The fissure sealed itself by morning. The mud pressed shut, erasing all evidence. New recruits arrived that day, marching over the ground as if nothing had happened. The veterans said nothing, only watched with haunted eyes, knowing the soil would claim them in time. Medics began recording strange deaths. Men collapsed suddenly, blood pouring from ears and eyes. Their bodies stiffened, mouths frozen open as if screaming at something unseen. Autopsies revealed burst vessels and fractured bones, yet no external wounds. The medics burned their notes, too afraid to keep them. Officers drafted reports, but higher command silenced them. Unexplained casualties became the official phrase, a tidy lie to mask the truth. The papers disappeared into locked cabinets, hidden away like the secrets already buried in the dirt. History was being rewritten even as it happened. The survivors whispered about an old curse, that battlefields drink blood not just as memory, but as fuel. They said the earth grows hungry where war rages longest. feeding on flesh until it becomes something else entirely. The ground beneath them was no longer soil, it was a predator. One evening, a soldier claimed he heard voices rising from the ground, not echoes of comrades, but voices older, heavier, speaking words no human tongue could shape. He pressed his ear to the mud and screamed, clawing at his face until he tore his own ears apart. The whispers spread, more men confessed to hearing them, some recognizing their mothers' voices, others swearing they heard the cries of soldiers already dead. Each voice beckoned them downward, promising rest, promising escape. A few followed, digging frantically with bare hands until the earth swallowed them whole. By the warsit's end, the ground was left untouched. Trenches collapsed, weapons rusted, and bodies decomposed. But the soil remained restless. Farmers who later tried to reclaim the land abandoned it quickly, saying their plows broke against bones too massive to be human. No, when the guns fell silent and the smoke cleared, the war left scars on nations, but some scars belonged to the land itself. Among the ruins and graves, there remain places where men never returned, where whispers say something still waits. It was not written into history books, not carved into memorials, yet its hunger is remembered by silence. The beast was buried in secrecy, but the earth never forgets. And if you stand in those woods long enough, you may feel it too. The same dread that consumed armies, a reminder that some enemies were never defeated, only hidden.